Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3, American Federalism. It's Lesson 17 about the current state of American federalism. In this lesson, you'll learn about the Supreme Court case of Gonzales versus Raich, about the Obamacare individual mandate, about the Supreme Court case of National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, and you'll learn about the current state of American federalism. In previous lessons, we've learned about a series of historical events that helped transform American federalism. These are not the only historical events we could have talked about, but they're particularly prominent ones. We also learned about the more recent developments of new federalism. While in the past we had the events of the Hamiltonian economic program, of the Civil War, of the New Deal and the Great Society, and the Rights Revolution, which all seemed to lead to larger national government and smaller state governments, new federalism brought in with the Reagan Revolution led to an arrest or a stop of the growth of the national government. But what it failed to do, which Reagan had wanted to do, was actually roll back the size of the national government. One of the prominent cases before the Supreme Court during this time of new federalism was the case of United States versus Lopez, which we learned about in the last lesson. In that case, the court acknowledged that there was a line of precedence that had allowed the national government to expand by justifying its expansions under the Commerce Clause. But then for the first time in almost 60 years, the Supreme Court said that they declined to expand the power of government any farther. But that's all it really did, was it declined to expand government. Again, it did not roll the powers of government back. So at the end of the last lesson, we redrew our diagram of federalism to include this idea from Lopez that there was a point beyond which the national government should not go. We put it on the diagram as what we call the Lopez wall. But it was drawn with a dashed line to signify that fact that the Lopez wall, if it's a wall at all, is a leaky wall. There's ways to get through it. And you're going to see that in this lesson. This lesson is going to talk about primarily two United States Supreme Court cases that demonstrate how the national government can continue to expand its power despite the precedent of Lopez being in place. The first of those cases is the medical marijuana case. Now, the background of this case is that the state of California legalized the medical use of marijuana. You can get a doctor's prescription in California that then permits you, by the laws of the state of California, to use marijuana. Now, even though California said that marijuana would not be illegal in the sense of them using any of their state powers to put anyone in jail for using it, marijuana continued to be considered illegal by the national government. So as a consequence, a resident of California with a doctor's note saying they can smoke marijuana could do so without having to worry about a local California police officer arresting them. But if a federal law enforcement person, such as a member of the Drug Enforcement Agency, were to encounter them, they could get arrested. So while California would say, we are not going to punish this under a law of California, the national government was still continuing to punish it under a national law. This then led to a situation where there was a woman named Raich who had a prescription from her doctor to use marijuana, and so she grew her own marijuana plants in her house, which she then harvested for her own smoking. She never bought or sold any marijuana, never intended to sell any of her marijuana. But then she was caught raising these marijuana plants in her home, and she was arrested by the national government. And her case ended up going all the way to the United States Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court got the case, they pointed out that something like marijuana is a fungible commodity. And what they mean by that is, even though you say you're going to keep it in your house and not sell it, theoretically you could. And even if you needed marijuana, you could sell the marijuana you have and buy it from somebody else. So they can't be sure exactly where that marijuana instilled in that is raised in your house is going to end up, even if you have a prescription to use it. Now, in recognizing that it's a fungible commodity, they also recognize, though, that the other place for the marijuana to go, besides staying in a person's house to be used, is to enter an illegal marketplace. And they said that's what Congress is trying to do when they pass a law prohibiting private use of marijuana. They're trying to control this illegal, unlawful market for drugs. Now, if Congress is trying to control that unlawful market for drugs, and that's a legitimate use of their Commerce Clause powers. Remember, just about any time Congress is trying to regulate private behavior, they're going to say Commerce Clause. You should have learned that from a previous lesson. But if they're trying to regulate this illegal market in marijuana and claiming they're doing so under the Commerce Clause, but then as an extension of that, they're telling Raich that she can't raise marijuana in her house for her own private use, they have to somehow be able to assert that it's necessary and proper that they tell Raich that she can't have this marijuana in her home in order to control this broader market among the states. Because remember, their power to regulate commerce, the buying and selling of things, is about commerce among the states, things that are moving back and forth across state lines. So they've got to be able to say in some way that her having those pot plants in her home is affecting marijuana moving back and forth from one state to another to be bought or sold. Now, when they make that argument, effectively what they're saying is that because Raich is raising these plants in her home and other people are permitted to do so under California law, that they therefore are not out purchasing illegal drugs in the marketplace, which will then affect that marketplace, such as by driving down the price of illegal drugs because there won't be as high of demand for them. Now think about what that argument means. If Congress is saying, oh, Raich, we can come arrest you because you sitting in your home smoking that marijuana that you raised yourself means you're not going to be out on a street corner buying it. Therefore, you're going to affect the legal drug trade out on the street corner by staying in your home to do it. What they seem to be saying is that they have power to stop her from growing marijuana in her own home, that they can thereby force her into the legal marketplace to keep the price where it's supposed to be. Because remember, that in the case, the quote I showed you in the previous slide, they were saying that by her staying home, she's affecting the price in the illegal marketplace. Well, she's only affecting the price if you assume that if she wasn't allowed to raise it at home, she would then go into the legal market. And that somehow you are trying to prevent her from raising it at home in order for the legal market to function normally, the illegal market to function normally. That's what makes this case so screwy, is the reasoning used by Congress to justify their law makes it almost seem like they want the illegal market to exist and that they're trying to regulate it and keep it existing in a certain way so that it's not allowable for someone to withdraw from that illegal market and just raise something in their own home for their own use. It's a very strange argument for them to make. But in making that argument, despite the Lopez precedent saying, hey, there are some areas that, particularly in the areas of criminal law, that should be really left to the states, the Supreme Court ended up ruling against Raich. And along the way, they made some very interesting comments, such as this, where they claimed that the federal government is obviously superior to that of the states in looking after the welfare and necessity of inhabitants. Now think about what that means. It's essentially an acknowledgement of the national government assuming the police powers we've talked about in previous lessons. Not just an acknowledgement of that, but a judgment that the national government's actually better at exercising the police power than the states are. Which again is another very interesting argument to make, since constitutionally speaking, as the Constitution was originally set up before the court started stretching the meaning of certain constitutional clauses, the way the Constitution was originally set up, it was the intention that the police power would reside in the states while the national government just had a few defined powers. Here we have the Supreme Court not only acknowledging that the national government has assumed the police power, but even claiming they're better at it than the states now, and therefore they should be left to do it. Now, there was a dissenting opinion in this case. That means at least one of the justices of the Supreme Court said, no, majority, you got it wrong. Raich should have won rather than lost. And that dissenting justice, Justice Clarence Thomas, lamented the fact that he believed that by rendering this decision the way they did, that they had abandoned any idea of ever limiting the national government's power under the Commerce Clause. For him, this was a signal that Lopez and Morrison, those two cases we learned about in the last lesson, were aberrations, that the Supreme Court was not going to follow that line of reasoning in the future, but was going to go back to the old idea of basically, you say Commerce Clause, and Congress, you can do anything you want. The next Supreme Court case to talk about in this lesson dealt with Obamacare. Now, Obamacare is the national health insurance program that was passed with President Obama in office, so it has his nickname, but it's actually called the Affordable Care Act. A major feature of the Affordable Care Act, which is acknowledged in the case of NFIB versus Sebelius, the Supreme Court case where they decided whether the act was constitutional or not, a major component of the case, of the law, is the idea of an individual mandate. A mandate that requires healthy individuals to go out and buy health insurance, which then subsidizes the costs of unhealthy individuals. Now, I can explain this better, I think, with a diagram. The essentials of Obamacare are that young, healthy people will be forced by the individual mandate to buy insurance that they otherwise don't really need. And in that way, they will then, their money that they pay for their insurance premiums will be funneled into insurance companies. The insurance companies then, under Obamacare, are required to pay out payments to sick and elderly people who can buy insurance without ever being denied, regardless of their health condition, and with no maximum benefits. So a person who's very sick can go in and buy health insurance and get a bunch of money paid by the health insurance company to help keep them alive. And the way that's going to be paid for is by forcing young and healthy people to buy insurance. So the individual mandate that the Supreme Court was passing judgment on is an essential feature of keeping this system working. Now, what made this different, though, from other Commerce Clause cases that come before the Supreme Court is, notice in the other ones, the government was trying to tell people what they couldn't do. You're not allowed to smoke pot. You're not allowed to carry a gun near a school, that kind of thing. This case, on the other hand, is a case that is requiring people to do certain things, to go out and buy a product that they otherwise would not want to. So the healthcare mandate, this is really important to realize, seems to go well beyond any other power that's ever been endorsed by the Supreme Court for Congress. All these other cases, they were saying, okay, yeah, Congress, you can prohibit people from doing things. Now Congress is trying to require people to do things. And that's what the Supreme Court had to pass judgment on in this Sebelius case. As they were considering the case, one of the hypotheticals that they asked to the government lawyers was, well, if you can require people to buy health insurance, could you decide to require them to buy vegetables because they're not eating healthy? And the government lawyer actually said, well, yeah, we could. And that's a rather extreme example that shows just how far-reaching this power is that the government was claiming. When the Supreme Court actually passed judgment on the issue, the way they ruled was to say, well, you know what, we think this actually does go past Congress's Commerce Clause power, kind of like in the Lopez and Morrison cases. Now, when the decision was first released and people read that far through it, they thought, oh my gosh, we're turning back from Raich. We're going back to the Lopez and Morrison standard that the national government's going to be restrained in some way. But the Supreme Court then went on, after saying, okay, this is outside the Commerce Clause powers, to then say, but Congress can enforce this under their taxing powers. And here's how. The penalty that would be assessed to people for not buying health insurance, that's how it was enforced. You wouldn't go to jail for not buying health insurance. Instead, you would pay a monetary penalty to the government. That penalty is paid when you pay your taxes. So they said, well, a way to look at it is they're not really penalizing people for not buying health insurance. Instead, they are just choosing to tax people more who don't buy health insurance. So it can be justified rather than under the Commerce Clause, instead under the taxing clause, where Congress is granted power in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to tax. So while the healthcare mandate could not be justified as an act of commerce, even as a necessary and proper action to regulate commerce, the the Supreme Court said it could be justified as a tax. In other words, the government can order you to go out and buy things that you otherwise wouldn't want to buy. And if you refuse to, it can charge you higher taxes. And remember, if you think way back to the case we had about McCulloch versus Maryland, where the power to tax is the power to destroy. That's how the government can compel you to do things if it can use its taxing power in that way. Anything they want you to do, they can simply then, using this case as a precedent, say, well, if you don't go do the thing we want, we'll just raise your taxes. And if they raise them enough, they can force just about anybody to do anything they want. So with that in mind, let's now see what this does to our model of federalism. Here's how we modeled the original understanding of federalism after the founding of the United States of America, with the states having large police powers, individuals having a few retained rights, and the national government having a few enumerated powers. We then dramatically changed that over time to where at the point of new federalism, which we discussed in the previous lesson, we had a vastly bigger national government, a smaller states with smaller authority than before, more acknowledged individual rights, and this wall that Lopez had sort of set up saying, okay, national government, you've gone this far, but we're not going to let you go any farther. Well, the Obamacare case seems to have broken through that wall in a vast way. One of the dissenting opinions in the dissenting opinion in the NFIB versus Sebelius case, written by some justices who disagreed with what the majority was saying. They pointed out that during the arguments before the Supreme Court, they asked the lawyers for the government if they could name any area of private conduct that couldn't be regulated in the way that they are regulated under Obamacare. And other than the things protected in the Bill of Rights, the government lawyers couldn't name anything. In other words, other than what's protected in the Bill of Rights, they were claiming authority to regulate anything and everything in our lives. So if we add that to our diagram, this interpretation of the taxing power in the Sebelius case dramatically expands out the power of government again, to where it essentially swallows up all the power that was originally claimed by the states other than people's unalienable rights. Basically, unless it's protected explicitly in the Constitution, the national government is claiming potential authority to regulate what you're doing in whatever area it is in your life. So, while the Sebelius case about Obamacare may have in a sense stopped further expansion of the Commerce Clause, quite possibly it enabled vast future expansion of government power under the taxing clause. So we have to ask ourselves, as sort of our last thought as we think about federalism, the national government appears to have all but swallowed all the powers of the states. What then? What if the national government wants more power in the future? Isn't all that's left to it to then to swallow up people's rights? It's something to think about. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, what market is regulated in the case of Gonzales versus Raich? Is it stocks and bonds, oil imports, real estate, or is it illegal drugs? The correct answer is illegal drugs. What does the Obamacare mandate require? Does it require us to purchase fresh vegetables, purchase health insurance, purchase electric cars, or to donate blood? Well, the correct answer is it requires us to purchase health insurance. But arguably, under the power claimed, they could require all those other things too. Under what power was the mandate upheld? Did the Supreme Court say it was okay under the taxing power, or the Commerce Clause, or the police power, or the General Welfare Clause? They specifically said it was okay under the taxing power. But as we saw, that expansion is big enough to really, in a sense, give the national government the police power. What does the national government say is outside its powers then, if it's claimed so much power? Is it any power that's not enumerated in the Constitution is outside its powers? Or the police powers outside its powers? Or the rights in the Bill of Rights outside its powers? Or foreign affairs outside the powers of the national government? Well, according to the lawyers in the Obamacare case, it's only the rights in the Bill of Rights that are outside the powers of the national government. All right, that does it for our last lesson in Unit 3 about American federalism. Our next lesson will be from Unit 4. It'll be Lesson 1, and it'll be about the characteristics of Congress.